So how you guys doing? You getting along? He treating you okay over there, MG? Okay, good. He's taking you snipe hunting later today? The office pranks have begun. Hello, minders. Welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Well, today we're going to look at a product that several of you have asked about. It is Ampersand's Aquabord. I've actually had a supply of a few of these for years, always intended to do some paintings on them, but today I want to talk about it a little more in depth and in detail, and I actually want to do a demo. This came on my radar more recently because of some new, or at least Aquabord products I haven't seen. I don't know if they're new. So we'll dive into that. I'll test this board in a way I love to test watercolors all the time, and that's with a spontaneous painting. And we'll talk about the differences between this and regular watercolor paper. We'll also answer a question that I had. Can you use this stuff to practice on? Yeah? No? Maybe? We'll dive into that. So let's get to it. All right, let's take a look at what Aquabord actually is. It's a masonite base, archival, acid-free. In fact, they're very proud of the fact that it is a museum quality series panel. See if you can see this. Archivaseal, patented sealing and coating technology for panels, only by Ampersand. Archivaseal protects against support, including discoloration. By support, they mean this right here. One of the problems a lot of times with masonite panels is that an artist may just go to a hardware store and buy any old masonite panel, and they're not necessarily archival. At least so I've heard. And then you mount something that is archival to the top, and discoloration can happen due to the support or due to the material that you use or the adhesive that you use to adhere it. So anyway, that's one thing they're pretty proud of. Let's look at their claims over here. The amazing watercolor surface, brilliant color, unmatched techniques, get rich luminous color and have complete control over your watercolors, endlessly glaze and lift to underlying layers of color, or black to white. And we're going to dig into that because most of that's true, but some of it I did not find to be true. Now, I've never done a video just on Aquabord, although I did introduce it in another video I did on watercolor canvas. So I bought these fairly inexpensive watercolor canvases at Hobby Lobby. This is the video I did on that. And while I was doing this video, I was comparing it to Aquabord, kind of, just sort of. So anyway, all of these products are coated with some form of absorbent ground. And all absorbent ground is a coating that simulates absorbent paper. Simulates but does not replicate, I hasten to add. They like to claim it's just as good as paper, but if that were true, these things would be like a runaway hit. I think they have their place, and that's one of the things we're going to talk about. There is no paper in here. They use a clay sort of material. Let me zoom in on this. This was a piece I did years ago while I was testing this out. First time I'd ever used Ampersand, and really probably the only time. All I've ever done since this little painting is tests. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this video today was for some playtime, just to kind of familiarize myself with it again. For the most part, it acted as expected. I think probably the biggest thing about this, and we'll call it both an advantage and a disadvantage, depending on what you're trying to do. And that is the fact that I can lift this paint quite easily. Now that makes for some great technique when you want to recover your whites. One of the biggest advantages, I think, of this is almost absolute freedom in being able to recover highlights. The reciprocal disadvantage, layers are going to get muddy. When you do a lot of layering, you're going to lift layers underneath it. However, I did find that you could do some layering. And I think another thing that put this on my radar again and got me to thinking about it was that I saw these cradles. These museum panel cradles. They're mounted to, again, museum quality birch. These would make for some very interesting sort of gallery mounts at different heights. This is a 1.5 inch, a 2 inch, and a 7/8 inch. And it kind of piqued my curiosity again about Aquabord. So that's just a side mention. Another advantage, and one of the reasons I was very interested in these to begin with, is I think they are great mixed media panels. This would make for a great combination of oil and watercolor, or acrylic and watercolor, using watercolor or acrylic as an underpainting, sealing it, and then painting oil on top of it. Great, great, great. Something I want to do. Something I have done, but I can imagine doing it on this panel. Another advantage is the clay material they use in the absorbent ground scrapes and scratches really easy. And I say that as an advantage because scratchboard artists use clayboard a lot. Alright, so what are the disadvantages? I'll run through those quickly before we get into demos. Well, first of all, it's a panel. It's not paper. So you're in a situation like you would be with oils. You've got to buy a panel or a canvas to preset sizes. You've got to cut them to the size that you want. So it's a lot more expensive than paper. So the flexibility is not there. And the other one, which I've already kind of alluded to, is layering. You do a lot of subtle glazing, and you can do some on this. I want to be clear about that. But it's still not as good as paper. And as I've already alluded to, also they're pricey. This is an expensive substrate, especially if you get into these cradle mounted panels like this. So basically you're using these only for finished work. I do not see these as an advantage over using paper for watercolor alone, unless a couple of factors. Unless you want to have some very, very heavy lifting ability. And that can be important because there are a lot of techniques that rely on lifting over using white. But just to do a normal run-of-the-mill watercolor, I probably wouldn't use this. Alright, so let's just go ahead and get into it and play around with this a little bit. Alright, I think I can get my whole setup on screen here so you can see it, palette included. This is my Sennelier palette. It's probably one of my most frequently used plein air palettes. It's like a pebbly texture. That kind of helps. Right here, I actually took a scrubber, a stiff bristle brush scrubber. This one to be precise. I was just seeing if I could scrub it back to white. And I could, but the problem is that the clay surface smooths out. So now it's like hot pressed paper right here. But one of the questions I want to answer today before we get too far into this is, can you practice with this? And I think the answer is yes and no. It depends. Depends on what you want to practice. We're going to start out though just doing some typical wet and wet washes. And I think just to wet this down, I'm going to use a sprayer. And you can tell it absorbs because some of these areas out here where the water first hit are already starting to look dry. What are we going to do here? Let's try a little bit of purple and ultramarine, tiny bit of Payne's gray. I'm just going to get in some sky there. One thing I'm curious is about the drying shift, how that compares to paper. See, it's starting to dry there, so there is definitely absorption. And this is one of the differences I've found already in this and watercolor canvas. Even though the watercolor canvas has some sort of an absorbent ground, it's a different type and it sits on top a lot more. I'm going to get some burnt sienna, a little bit of glycerin crimson hue, so get a real reddish brown going here. And boy, that is just already absorbed and dried. Watercolor canvas definitely doesn't do that. I'm going to wet this down some more. Create some kind of center of interest there, although I have no idea what it is. This is spontaneous. It absorbs, but it's not quite the same. It's like you can see, you can move color out of the way real easy. So there is a certain amount of sitting on top. So let's get the paper towel and pick up some of that rundown. I'm on a real gentle, about a 10-degree angle. So there's going to be a little bit of rundown, especially when I use that much spray. And see, it's probably hard to tell, but this is very matte and dry. So it's drying very quick. Interesting. All right, well, it's wet. Let's see if it does anything like a background. It's a little too wet. If it were paper, it'd be a little too wet for a background, but yeah, you get them. Oh, that's cool. You get some nice, very dramatic lifting compared to paper, even while it's wet. I'm using some very brilliant colors here. It's one of the things I'm curious about. It's just how vivid they stay. Theoretically, you would think they would be a lot more vivid since it's going to sit on top more than with paper. Intrigued by how quickly it dries. They were comparing this to something like Yupo, which has no absorption whatsoever. That takes forever to dry. So fast drying, but still sitting very much on top. All right, let's cover all the bases. Let's do some spatter. Some of the spatter should stay fairly solid, and some of it should run. It's still mostly wet in here. I'm going to miss this area over here, but without that, so I'm going to put my hand there to guard it. So fun to watch watercolor paint itself. So fun. It's so similar to watercolor paper, but yet there are some very pronounced differences. There's some really nice control factors in here. And having used this in the past, I didn't remember getting, but probably because I didn't do this kind of a loose, washy thing. I'm going to start trying to hint at some little tree spires here. Too fun. Too fun. Is anything too fun? You know what? I think I am going to let that dry. And what I want to do when I come back is really play up the biggest strength of this substrate, and that is lifting. As long as you're going to paint on something like this, don't treat it like regular paper. Use its strengths, and in this case that is lifting. It's really easy to be imprecise and overdo it on paper. Paper peels back, it pills back. This does not. Scrubbers are soft and imprecise. This is, I already know from experience, it's much easier to be precise with your lifting on this, so we're going to explore that. Let's let this dry. Alright, so this is dry, and we do have a little bit of drying shift, definitely not as much as you get in paper. One very notable thing right off is that the more watery washes push out to the edge, sort of the same effect you get on cheap paper, non-cotton paper. So you can see see these edges here, and these were very wet washes. This is also still damp. However, I don't think it's going to affect painting. In other words, it's not going to be, it's not going to bleed or spread the way a wet paper would. But I can feel it. It's very cold and damp still. So this clay surface absorbs a lot of water. But I'm noticing that these hard edges, so something I wouldn't want to encourage. Now here is where, as I mentioned, this shines. You've got the ability to come in here and rework this color. And that's a two-edged sword. Let me get even closer. So you got to be very careful how much water is on your brush. More than just a very damp brush and you're lifting. Put just a tiny bit of moisture on your brush and you can kind of blend out these edges. Something that would be a little more difficult in paper. Now I'm lifting on purpose here. I want to see how hard I have to press. So it doesn't take much to move this paint off of the surface. Almost nothing, and almost nothing pressure wise, and almost nothing water wise. So I got myself a nice little light colored tree. Now here is what I think is an advantage. Painting on a surface that lifts that easy is tough. It's almost as tough as Yupo, not quite. But here's what I really like about this is the precision in the lifting. Now you can lift with regular watercolor paper, but you usually can't get it that white and that sharp and crisp. So I'm not saying you've got necessarily the same control that you would have with, say, gouache. Definitely not the same value and blending control, but more control than paper. So I think I'm going to get out a softer brush, Silver Black Velvet, which is probably one of my softest watercolor brushes, and just see what I can do in glazing. And glazing always works better on paper if you're glazing over lighter colors, and I know that's going to be the case here because of how easy it's lifting. So let me get a light sort of yellow-brown glaze here. That works all right. Let's try some lifting with a softer brush, see if that gives me any more control. The only problem is these Silver Black Velvets hold a lot of water. That does give me more control because you don't have the stiff brush action. So I mean, that's kind of a duh. Silver Black Velvets don't provide a whole lot of lifting on paper because they are so soft, but here it's just kind of the compromise and the adjustment that you need to give yourself a little bit more control. So I don't really know. The question I came into this video having and mentioned was whether this would work great for practice. And I don't know that it does. It is such a different animal. I mean, it's fun to work with. For one thing, I don't recommend these Aquabords for beginners at all. So, you know, the thinking that a beginner can try out strokes, can try out washes, do different kinds of techniques, and not worry about ruining paper. And you can go back, I could go back and wash all this off with water. I actually had some paint on here and washed it off. But I don't think you're practicing. It's the same reason I don't like cheap paper, because it acts so differently that you're not really practicing the way good paper acts. The same is here. The techniques are a little different. They look different. They react differently. If you're a little more experienced in handling watercolor and you're more of an alla prima painter, that means doing everything in single layers. If you're that kind of a painter, watercolor painter, this would be a lot of fun. If you're a meticulous glazer, spontaneous landscapes, I don't do a lot of glazing, but I do some. If I were doing a portrait, this might be frustrating. Again, if I'm going for a style that looks lifted, here's a couple of artists that do that style, just so you'll understand what I'm talking about. That do a style that looks very lifted, and it is actually part of the style. Now, they don't do it with this board, but it's a similar technique. If you look in the highlights in particular, like the fingers, specifically highlights on this face. In this chair, it's a little more obvious in this chair. Lifting has a very unique and identifiable look to it. Pretty sure he used oils. Concept was the same. He would use like turpentine oil washes, I believe. And that's what I'm talking about. You may want to pick this kind of a surface if you want to try some unusual techniques like that. And I do plan to do some mixed media where I use some interesting techniques. One of them is to tint the background completely, like make it gold or brown or yellow with permanent ink, so that never gets lifted. And then go do your watercolor on top of that, and then lift back to those golden highlights. Lots of possibilities, lots of possibilities. All right, well, we're going to wrap this video up, and I just wanted to show you a couple things. Now, this has been sitting for a day, and I've come back and been fiddling with it. First of all, I wanted to look at the lifting. You can see I was lifting out some vertical trunks here. Anytime you loosen it up, just have a blotter, like a tissue or paper towel, handy, because you will be blotting quite a lot. For instance, if I go to lift a line here, what I first end up with is a line of paint. So I try to get that out of the way right away. And it usually takes me a couple passes. So there I did a very precise, crisp line as if I'd painted that in white. And I think that's a strength, this blotting. Now you'll probably notice I've done a lot of work here, and I kind of defined this. Almost everything I have done here, in fact, probably 99% of it, has just been either lifting or redistributing the paint that was there, which I thought was interesting. I'm still not done, and I probably won't finish in this video, but I've been working on this area up here just to define the tops. Lifting, removing paint. The best way I've found to do that is, let me demonstrate. I'm just gonna, I'm distributing some water. It's not lifting everything, but it is loosening the paint. Then I'm blotting to dry that area. And I'm still keeping a fairly smooth result. And really all I wanted to do here was lighten. Subtlety is kind of the way forward. And again, to reiterate what I said earlier, I don't think you're going to be very happy with this paper or board if what you're wanting to do is very controlled, soft watercolor washes. You're just going to be frustrated. However, if you want to have a board that will give you some interesting technique to play with, then maybe it's for you. And I keep going back to the idea of mixed media. I mentioned oil and acrylic and using this as an underpainting base, and that's something I'll explore in the future. But here's another one, and this works here just as well as it does on watercolor paper, is colored pencil. And it could go under the watercolor or on top. If you go under, you have to make sure that you don't do a lot of heavy burnished coverage. But if you're going linear, that's fine. So I've got these little puffs from the spatter. I thought about lifting them out, but maybe I'll just make a very faint distant tree. And just kind of weave in a bit of a dark line here. I really like the way this paper or this board takes colored pencil. Just add a couple more out here. Now that's fun. I want to go and do it everywhere now. I probably will later, but this video's long. We need to wrap it up. One last thing. I mentioned it, but I haven't demonstrated it. Scraping. You scratchboard artists or those who've played around with scratchboard will understand this and how it works. But it scrapes very easily. Much more easily than paper. You can do this on paper, but it comes out looking kind of raggedy sometimes. However, just be careful, don't gouge. You know, just basically a light touch. You're just trying to take paint off the surface. But because of that clay surface that's in the ground, it does scrape pretty easily. Your blade needs to be pretty sharp. If you've got some scratchboard tools, you could probably try those. I don't have any, and I've done quite a bit that's not on video at lifting, you know, just lifted little highlight areas here and there. So again, I continue to think of this as a surface that is best by maximizing that potential. Okay, I've talked this to death. Thank you everyone for watching. Hope that you learned something from that. If nothing else, you learn that it's something you don't want to buy. And to me, that's just as beneficial. Thank you, Minders. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, patrons. We are over 700 patrons now. I'm so thrilled and excited by that. Thank you for your support. We will see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.